Hello beautiful friends, welcome back to Roots and Refuge Farm. My name is Jess and I'm standing outside my garden. We're about to go in and do the first unofficial garden tour of 2019 where I'm going to talk to you about my plan for this gardening year. To be entirely honest, I don't have this plan completely nailed down yet. I have a lot of ideas, but they are subject to change on my whims whenever I get started in this project. I like to loosely get an idea of what I want to do, configure those things, but that could change whenever it comes down to actually putting stuff in the ground. Now this area over here, which has been prepped by the pigs, you can see Journey Pig still down there on the end. We'll be moving her out of there this week because pig manure needs 60 days before it can be planted in. So I'm gonna have to get her out. So this area is going to be our cottage garden perennial area where we're going to establish some things to come back year after year. As you can see here, we've got the early stages of what will be our window greenhouse. And my plan is to create a really pretty pathway here straight ahead into the greenhouse. Now this is lined up with where there will be a sitting pavilion right here. So these buildings will kind of mirror each other here, and I think that will add a lot of beauty. And within this area, there are going to be a couple of pathways that go off either way. In the back here, on either side of the window greenhouse, I want to leave a space to plant some tall things like sunflowers. And then I'd really like to be able to keep things like a little symmetrical. Now I actually like things to be a little ununiform, a little irregular and hodgepodge, but when it comes to designing the garden, and this has kind of been my stance, there is a lot of symmetry in my garden, and so I like for there to be like structural symmetry so that the chaos and the wildness in that can feel kind of ordered. I don't know if that makes sense at all. So kind of what I'm looking at here in this space is the greenhouse in the middle and a path right down the middle, and I'm thinking of using some arch trellises over that path to pull that aspect into this space. And then I think that we may line the sides like here and down on the other end with some low raised beds or just some bordered areas that will kind of mimic each other and mirror each other. And same thing on the back side of the greenhouse, sort of like mirrored sides. And then all of this area in between, I'm thinking some curved paths and just really densely planted beds with lots of flowers, pollinator attractors, herbs, lots of perennials. This year I am going to be primarily planting plants that will reseed, and then probably in the fall I will look at putting some bulbs and stuff in which can grow next year. So I'm kind of looking at this space with like a 2-year plan in mind to get this really thoroughly established, but I'm really excited about it. Now, and I don't know if we're going to do it now or if we're going to wait, but we're talking about putting a fence up kind of here, like a low fence, maybe like a little picket fence or something, to sort of differentiate the herb garden from this main space. I don't really know for sure yet, but I liked the idea of a fence, and then here where this walkway goes down with the arches over it, having something like a cute little gate where you could go into that space and also that we could close it off. And actually, considering that the greenhouse is going to be repurposed windows and a lot of trim that we're going to actually paint white, we're talking about a couple of design things that we can incorporate in this, because I don't want this to be so cottagey and white picket fence and all of that stuff that it feels disconnected from the rusticness of our raised bed. So we're looking at how to incorporate those things so that the whole garden feels very cohesive. It is going to still have that kind of hodgepodge theme to it, you know, like the pink front door, and kind of pulling some pops of color and stuff like that in. And I think some of those things we're going to just figure out as we go. I have lots of ideas and I'm really excited about it. All right, so over here to the beds. As of right now, I am planning on leaving all of my arch trellises the same. Those can be reconfigured year after year. It's not that big of a deal to take them down. You just cut the zip ties, pull the trellis off, and then pull out those T-posts. It's not fun. It's not like we're gonna be like, oh yeah, moving some arch trellises today, what a blast. But you can do it. It's not just super labor intensive. However, I like where they're at right now, and I don't feel like I really need to move them around. So I am moving some trellises, but I've decided to leave those the same. I'm also, for the most part, leaving all of my trellis walls, is what I call them. Now this one on the end is the only one that I have that's just made out of fencing. The rest of them are cattle panels. But this one is a 6-foot roll of fence that's stretched out down along some T-posts. And this is not quite as sturdy as the cattle panels. Last year I grew beans on this at one point, peas on it at one point, some cucumbers, and some tomatoes. I did not care for the tomatoes on this fence trellis, you know, opposed to the cattle panels. The cattle panels have much larger openings, and so it was easier to weave the tomatoes throughout. So I think I'm going to stick to using this for green beans this year is my plan. And what that will probably look like is here at the beginning of the season, this may be where I grow a large amount of our peas, because here in Arkansas in about May, when it begins getting really warm, we'll be harvesting our peas and then they'll be done. So I'll pull all of those out and I can at that point plant green beans, pole beans. I typically will plant Kentucky Wonder pole beans, and there are a couple different varieties of purple pole beans that I like. And I'm thinking that if I plant this whole row, this trellis is probably about 25 feet long, that will provide a lot of our green bean needs. Come on. I've still got dead plants in here. I've been pulling everything out. Now, the long beds in my garden run east to west. So the sun comes up over on this side. And that means that even when I have these trellis walls, they're typically not casting any shadows on the other side of the bed. That's something that you would want to take into consideration whenever you are planning your garden, especially if you're doing it for the first time and you're using a lot of vertical supports for the first time. Just consider where the sun comes up and comes down. Having some shaded areas is not a bad thing, especially if you live in a really hot area like us. A little shade is nice. Some cucumbers can appreciate a little shade. In the heat of the late spring and early summer, you can possibly get a little more time out of lettuce in a little shade. But you want to consider that when you're planting things like peppers, because they wouldn't like that. This bed has quite a lot of weeds in it, and I just noticed this. That is not a weed. Carrots. Little sneaky guys. Those are left over from the fall, obviously. There's another one. Oh, that's silly. Look at that. The garden in her neglect is still giving us snacks. So down here on the end of this bed is currently this little short trellis. That's gonna come out, and in this end space, I'm going to plant okra. Ernie Pig's hollering at me. Maya's back there working on the pig pens. She's about to move back to the backyard. Now okra grows tall, so it's gonna kind of fill up that whole end of this bed. And here on this arch trellis, I'm planning on putting noodle beans because they're really visually dynamic. They grow great on an arch trellis because they all hang down. I leave a little bit of space between my trellises and the wall. The reason I do that is because I like to plant on the inside. It just gives me easy access to the root systems. It's easy to pull out and easy to weed around to make sure that there's nothing competing with those plants. And also, since those noodle beans will be on the inside of that trellis, I've kind of got almost 3 feet here, maybe a little bit more, on this side of the trellis. And so I will probably plant something like squash, something that's going to come to fruition pretty early right there. And here on the other side of this fence wall where I'm going to put peas early on in the season, I'm going to wait to plant this, and I will not be planting any of my spring stuff in this side. I'll probably plant, once it gets warm, I'll plant things like peppers and eggplants over on this side of this trellis, because the fact that those peas are going to be finishing up in May and I'm going to tear them all down and replant it with beans. There will be like a 3-4 week window before those beans really start climbing, that space is gonna look really naked. And so instead of planting lettuces and radishes and beets, all of those things that are gonna really be petering out at the beginning of the summer, I don't want to put those here because if I'm tearing those out at the same time as tearing the peas out, this entry where you come into my garden and this first bed is gonna look really bare. So I wanna plant the things that are gonna be coming into their prettiest and fullest and most fruitful season around the time that those peas are getting pulled out. Now I've been debating on this trellis right when you come in the garden door, and I think I finally decided what I'm going to put here. I loved my Kajari melons last year that I grew on the trellis. They were really beautiful. They were really interesting, hanging down even whenever they were in their little supports just to keep from falling off. And the foliage was so lush. It was just a really beautiful plant on the trellis. So I think that's what I'm gonna put here. Last year I had some beans that didn't do very well. That trellis looked really naked all year, and it's the first one you see when you come in the garden. So I'm trying to be really more intentional with this space, trying to avoid some of the things that I did last year, like planting all of my spring stuff in one place so that I had a really bare spot in my garden come June. Here, these two walls are where I grew my tomatoes last year. All of my slicer plants, for the most part, went down these two rows, and I'm actually leaving that the same this year. Now there's a lot of talk about crop rotation and the necessity of that, and people belong to different camps. I have found that the people that I have been studying, specifically back to Eden Gardening and Charles Dowding, Paul and Charles both state that crop rotation is unnecessary as long as you're minding your soil health. We are not doing any sort of tilling this year. We're just adding on layers of compost, continuing to mulch, and I am actually not going to rotate my crops. I did last year. It's really only so reasonable within a home garden to expect to be able to rotate your crops every year. So I'm just gonna put them in the same place, and we're gonna hope that that works out. Now on this side of the tomato wall is where we will mix in multiple things like eggplants, peppers, different flowers. We'll possibly go ahead and do some kale and lettuce just spaced out. Like I said, I don't want to do the spring crops all clumped together so that I don't have any super huge bald spots whenever they begin to die off. I think that the tomatoes are going to be the only thing that I do long rows of this year. I plant my tomatoes pretty close together, about 20 inches apart, and that is because we do prune them pretty heavily. And so I'm going to leave them the same, but I don't think that there are going to be any other like long rows of things, long rows of peppers, long rows of eggplants. Everything else I would really like to diversify. The reason why I'm doing my tomatoes all together is just because we do the cattle panel trellising, and it's a lot easier to just keep them all in one place. You see, we've got this cattle panel running down one side of this 4-foot bed, and the other side is just open. I basically view these as 2 garden rows. 1 garden row, 2 garden row. They don't have space in between them. Whenever you read gardening advice and it tells you row spacing, that really doesn't have anything to do with what the plant needs. You can kind of go based off of what it tells you to space out between plants. Like it says they need 18 inches between plants. What I do is I just make sure they have 18 inches pretty much the whole way around. Row spacing is typically figured in to allow people to get equipment in between garden rows, like tillers and stuff. Obviously we don't need that in this situation. So in a 4-foot bed, I just treat it as 2 2-foot wide rows. So I will plant things all the way down this side, and then my tomatoes I will plant all the way down this side 18 inches to 20 inches apart, so that they can climb up this. I just treat this like its own little row, and we'll plant eggplants, peppers, lettuces, flowers, all accordingly. Over on this side, we have these 2 beds, which last year we had a couple of partial trellises, more things planted in between. Down here on the end I had some pepper plants. This year we're actually going to reconfigure this and make another direct wall of trellises that goes all the way down through the length of this bed and through that bed. So this is actually also going to be tomatoes this year. So I am expanding this tomato space here, which means that the other sides of these beds here will be, again, peppers, eggplants, bush beans. I'll probably put bush beans along next to those, like the dragon tongue bush beans and Tanya's pink pod beans. And in these beds with the tomatoes, I'm planning on doing a little bit of the spring stuff, chards and greens, kale. I'm not planting any more cabbage or broccoli this spring because we're still finishing off the stuff that overwintered. So basically there's gonna just be a lot of diversity kind of anchored around those tomato wall trellises. This trellis will be coming out, and I'm not gonna do any more partial trellises in these short beds. It was just kind of bad placement last year. The weeds between these two got kind of hard to pull out and they got a little carried away. Now this is where my holy basil was last year, and I'm actually prepared for that to come back. It reseeded itself really heavily. So in my mind, this is going to be the holy basil spot. I think that it probably will come back, and if it doesn't, I'm gonna plant some there. So I'll just leave that the same this year. And this was the trellis that we did kajaris on last year. Of course, I'm going to move those over. I'm planning on doing small melons like that on 4 or 5 of our 14 trellises. The other one of these will be for cucumbers, and I'm thinking that I will mirror the same thing. So a melon and a cucumber. Oh yeah, there's our little greens. Those were good, huh? Lots of people have been sending us pictures of their salad green totes. Some people told us that it didn't work for them, and of course there are so many different factors, but now is even a really good time to start that, as long as you don't live in like the super frozen north, at which point it wouldn't be a good time to start that. But if you're anywhere like us in the kind of lower half of the United States, you can probably have a lot of success starting that right now, because we're getting a lot longer days. I will put a link to that project video here and down below so you can check it out. So I'm gonna mirror here either a melon and a cucumber, and then a different kind of melon and cucumber over on that side. Here in the heat, the melons will go longer than the cucumbers. I will want to be prepared to replant whatever I take off of that cucumber trellis, because those kind of last through June here. When it starts getting really, really hot, the cucumbers typically peter out. Back here in the back, these 4x4 foot square beds, I really enjoyed using those for squash last year. One thing that I like to do in a, let's say a bed like this, or any of them, for instance, if I'm going to plant something like a summer squash, the plant's going to get, it's gonna get really large really fast, and so it needs a lot of space. Like I will plant 2 summer squash seeds in the middle of a 4x4 foot bed, and they get that whole bed, because those plants will grow really large, even right next to each other. They'll produce a ton, and they'll fill up that 4x4 bed. But not at first. The first 3 or 4 weeks, the plants are really getting established. So what I like to do in a space like that is that I'll plant my squash directly in the middle, and then all around here, I'll plant a couple rows of radishes, just around the entire thing, just all around the edge. 2 or 3 rows of radishes pretty close together, you know, like maybe 3 inches apart, enough for a small globe of radish to develop, because radishes take like 23 to 28 days. And so by the time that those squash plants are getting larger to where they're pressing in on the outer area of that bed where they really need the whole bed, the radishes are ready to harvest. Same thing with okra. Any plants that are going to get really big and you're having to give them a large amount of space in a raised bed, you can plant radishes all around them right when you first seed those. And as soon as those things are starting to really demand their space, the radishes are done, you pull them out, and that way you didn't waste that space. You kind of get a little more out of it that way. That's why you'll notice that I don't really have like a designated radish space. I won't really designate a space for those. They will just get plugged in all over the place in the future shadow of anything that's going to have a larger footprint here in a couple of months. Last year, this little area of my garden was my favorite space in the entire garden. There were a bunch of zinnias right here. There was okra down the side, and these trellises were largely covered. So I'm thinking that I'm actually going to plant some okra on one side of one of these 12-foot beds. I want to make sure that the trellises here are really lush, that they're, you know, they're really pretty and they're really full, and that the sides of those, that there's some low stuff and some taller stuff. I also loved the zinnia patches. I had just a couple of zinnia patches last year. Zinnias get really big. I mean, they were in raised beds, but they came up to about right here on me by the end of the summer. And the pollinators loved them. So designating a space for zinnias to just really take over, I found to be a very beneficial thing in the vegetable garden. Hey, beautiful boy. Another thing that I'm thinking will be a really great thing for the lower side of these short beds that have multiple arch trellises are things that vine a little bit. Last year I did dragon tongue bush beans on the sides of some of these. I did purple whole peas. These are things that are not technically pole beans, but they do have runners. They put off some runners. And it was really nice to kind of have them. They were a little rambly, they were a little wild, but still somewhat compact. And I liked doing those on the sides of these. Last year, this was okra, which I'm gonna make it a little different this year. This year I'm going to extend this trellis wall all the way down to the end, and I'm going to expand the cherry tomatoes. Now you may be thinking, what in the world are we going to do with all of these tomatoes? Because last year we were picking 5 pounds of cherry tomatoes twice a week just off of what we had, and now I'm talking about expanding it. However, I didn't dehydrate nearly as many tomatoes last year as I wished I had, and you can only really eat so many cherry tomatoes raw, and we did. We ate a ton of cherry tomatoes raw, and everybody who came to visit, there was constantly a bowl of cherry tomatoes on the counter that everybody who would come over would just sit and snack out of it. It was wonderful. But I would really like to dehydrate more this year, pack them in oil with some Italian seasoning, and have those over the winter. I canned a lot of tomatoes last year, and I froze a lot of tomatoes last year, and I did dehydrate some. As soon as I dehydrated them, they would get eaten. My family really liked them. So if I can't preserve enough to actually have something to save because they're getting eaten so fast, that's kind of my cue to say, all right, this is something to grow more of, because they'll still get eaten fresh in that volume, and then if you have more, then you can put some up, which they'll get eaten over the winter. This trellis here, you can see the remains of green beans on it. This is actually the one that we're going to just pick up and move over onto this side, so it's going to extend that wall, and that's going to take out this area where this does not have a trellis. Same thing here, there's just a little piece. I'm just going to take all of these like trellis pieces out. These are around from having tomatoes last year, just in various places throughout the garden, and I am really concentrating my tomatoes this year so that they're not you know, hodgepodge here and there. I want them to be on those trellis walls. My reasoning for that is just because last year I would forget to come prune, you know, the 2 random tomatoes that were in this bed surrounded by a lot of other things. I would prune the main ones and then just kind of space out on that, and they just didn't do as well because they weren't as maintained as the other. So for the sake of simplicity, I'd like to keep all of those in the same place. Because the way that we have configured our trellises where they are kind of staggered here, we have these areas in the garden bed which are like 3.5 feet. Now these are great areas for us for things like bush squashes, for a little grouped area of bush beans, or for, you know, a handful of pepper plants all in one area. Pulling a turnip for the chickens. Good job. The potato tower idea, this is getting scrapped this year. These are coming out. It did not work like we hoped. Instead, this year, we are planning on actually planting some potatoes in one of the beds. So it's kind of confusing when you start reading about companion planting, because a lot of like really definitive statements are made. Like, do not plant this next to this because they are bad neighbors. And a lot of times they don't say why, and sometimes it's just that they attract the same pest or whatever. But potatoes are said to be poor neighbors to nightshade, and since I'm putting tomatoes in a lot of areas in my garden and then companion planting them with eggplants and peppers, I'm planning on this end here of where I'm taking this trellis out and moving it over to extend the cherry tomato wall. I'm planning on possibly putting the potatoes in the bed like right here on this end and giving them an area where I can be sure that they're not going to be next to nightshades. They are said to be good neighbors to beans, so I will probably do some sort of green beans on this first trellis if I make the end of this like a potato bed. I can go ahead and put the squash and the cucumbers. That's another thing that they say not to plant potatoes near, and these are inevitably going to have some squash and cucumbers. So I don't think I'm going to put dried beans on any arch trellises this year. The dried beans did great. They covered up to the top, they grew, but the volume that you got on this small of a space, it was really hardly worth it, and I can grow significantly more volume of food if I do something different. Here in this square bed on the end is my garlic. I planted this this a few months ago, and it's doing really nicely. As you can see, all of these different sprouts coming up, and then these really large ones, that's the elephant garlic. And this on the end is a bed that has lemongrass and mint, and they come back every year. Actually, it's, yeah, see, you can see it's starting now to go ahead and sprout back. And that smells so good. And here, I'll come and cut this all back. As you can see, the lemongrass is starting again to sprout up down there. This side of my garden got kind of sorely neglected last year. It was just sort of an afterthought, and I sowed everything over here just kind of like, just threw stuff in, and then didn't mind it as much as I did everything else. So I'm wanting to be more intentional. Now in the fall, I actually planted this long row, the whole side of this last bed with a really thin French green bean that I cannot remember the name of, and it is driving me crazy. I would love to do that again. However, I'm gonna wait and see how much that whole wall of green beans really produces. I might be really getting carried away with the green beans. I love green beans. My family isn't crazy about them, but they will eat them. And so, I don't know, they just grow so well here. So it's kind of one of those things that I feel like maybe I should just grow a lot of them just because I can. What goes in here will probably depend on how many peppers I end up deciding to plant. These little partial trellises are going to come out. I had this walking stick kale here. It was doing really well until we got freezing rain the other day. I'm gonna take these out, and this is going to be another area of okra. One of the questions that we've been getting asked a lot is basically how we're deciding how much of each thing to plant. And the charts vary pretty wildly. Like if you go on, some of them say you need 5 tomato plants per person in your family. Some say you need 30. I say it's probably pretty stinking hard to decide what you need based on a chart, because there are so many variables into how stuff is going to grow. Are you going to prune it down to one stalk? What's your soil like? There's just so many things. Like for instance, some people would say that I'm absolutely nuts for wanting to plant 25 cherry tomato plants, because that's a ton of cherry tomatoes. However, I have in mind a specific need for those, which is dehydrating them and packing them in oil. So this is one of those things that if you're brand new and you're trying to decide what to plant, it's really hard for me to help you. It's really hard for me to say this is definitely what you should do. I can tell you some things, like that okra is really prolific. So you might get a lot of okra off just a few plants, but the thing is you have to harvest it every single day, sometimes twice a day. It grows really fast. The problem is that you might harvest 5 pieces off of it one day, 4 pieces of it off of it the next day, 6 pieces off of it the next day. But if you've got a pretty large family, you might not be able to just run out and harvest what you need to fry it up that night for dinner. So for me, when I'm figuring out how much I need, I may plant 12 okra plants, which is going to produce a lot of okra, but I need for it to produce enough within a 2-day period to really make like a full serving in a meal, which means that there are a lot of days, since we're not going to eat okra in meals every single day, there are a lot of days that I'm having to figure out how to use that. Therefore, we eat okra in a lot of other ways. We eat it raw in the garden a lot. Me and the kids will eat it raw in the garden, bake it, grill it, just blister it. You can pickle it. That's a really great thing to do with excess okra. And so that's what I'm saying. Like whenever you're planting these things like peppers, I'm gonna plant a lot of pepper plants. If you were only considering fresh eating, you would probably be fine with like a couple of sweet pepper plants and a couple of hot pepper plants for a family. However, if you're wanting to dehydrate those and make any sort of seasoning powder, you need to consider that. If you're wanting to pickle all of the jalapenos that you're gonna eat in a year, you need to consider that. If you're wanting to make hot sauce, you need to consider that. So I might plant 80 to 100 pepper plants for our family and still have to buy some things, because that might not be enough to do everything that I'm wanting to do. My advice whenever you're planting your garden, if you're trying to figure out how much to plant, you know, realistically think about the amount of time that you're wanting to put in it, and then also think about, what am I wanting to do here? Are you wanting to can all of your family's salsa and pizza sauce for a year? Are you wanting to just have some extra tomatoes to eat on a salad? And you know, some extra peppers to make salsa while everything is in season. Because how much you plant is really going to be dependent on your goals and how much time you're willing to put into it. Another thing to consider is how well things preserve. Zucchini, for instance, it's not great frozen. You can freeze it and it's okay after it's frozen, eaten in like casseroles maybe, or like baked into bread, like it does okay for that. And you can dry it. It's good dehydrated to eat like chips. And I've known some people to go ahead and make it into like zoodles and then go ahead and freeze it, and they say that that does okay. But the texture gets a little weird after it's been frozen. And so you have to consider that. Like, do not, I don't care if you have a huge family, don't plant 10 summer squash plants at the same time, because you're going to be feeding everybody that you know summer squash. You are going to have people running away from you when you approach them with summer squash, like shutting the blinds, because they're not gonna want it because you're gonna have so much. What I like to do when it comes to stuff like that, when I first plant my garden, like as soon as the frost has passed, I'll plant 2 summer squash plants. I'll have a space planned out for my next summer squash plants, and then in 3 weeks, I'll plant 2 more. In 3 weeks, I'll plant 2 more. We have really bad squash bugs here, and so I kind of proactively stagger those squash plants so that if some succumb to squash bugs, I've got other plants coming up behind it. That way we have fresh summer squash all throughout the season. And it's gonna be the same thing for things like radishes. Like I was saying, you can sow those around things that are gonna get big, but you need to keep in mind when you sow those, what you're gonna do with them when they're done. Now, we roast radishes here and use them as a side to like main dishes. And so we can go through a lot of radishes at once. I can cut up 100 radishes and we'll eat them in place of like potatoes or a grain or something with our dinner. Everybody in my family will eat them. There are 7 of us, and so we can put away some radishes. But if you're only eating them fresh on salads, you don't need to plant 1,000 radishes at the same time, or else you're just not gonna be able to use them. All throughout these beds, like I said, that I was going to be staggering out and diversifying, I will also be placing some companion flowers, things like nasturtiums, marigolds, some chamomile, some borage. All of those will be placed around different areas because I really want to create a space for pollinators, even though we are going to have the cottage garden that's going to be full of that stuff. And also I'll be planting herbs throughout here. Specifically basil, I like to put that all over. That's a really great companion plant. I really plant way more basil than we really use, even though we use a lot of it. Now we can use some basil. We will use that in pestos. It's a great flavoring for like lemonade. Strawberry basil lemonade is so good. And to put it for fresh eating in salads with some mozzarella and some tomatoes, man, that's one of my favorite things to eat in the summer. And I also plant multiple different types of basils. We'll plant Thai basil, cinnamon basil, lemon basil. Of course, we've got the holy basil for the medicinal properties. So there will be herbs throughout the garden beds, but a lot of the herbs are going to be in the cottage garden. Watermelons are not going to be in this space. We are actually going to plant watermelons in the backyard. We're doing an in-ground garden back there. Hopefully doing like a back to Eden style with wood chips. We were able to get some wood chips which we're putting down in the walkways, but that's kind of loosely the plan right now. I love watermelon. I would like to grow a lot of watermelon, but it's not the best choice for me in the raised beds. Now obviously my plan is not complete. My garden plan is going to develop and change over the next couple of months, but I have a general idea of what I want to do, and I can reconfigure my trellises and I can begin amending my beds. I'll be direct sowing our sweet peas, calendula, root vegetables, those radishes, and some lettuces and kales here this week. And since I know where I want things to be generally in the long run, I can feel confident that where I'm putting those is not going to limit me in 6 weeks when I'm trying to place all of my summer stuff. So that's it for my loose garden plan, which is likely to change. I'm likely going to try to stuff a lot more stuff in here than I'm even considering gathering right now. I'm excited to try some new things, and I would love to hear your suggestions. If you've noticed these trellises, if you've noticed our layout and you think, oh, I think this would be perfect there, please tell me down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I have been dreaming of doing my first real garden tour with you guys whenever I'm taking you through, showing you where we put everything and how it's doing. Getting to share that with you is amazing. Even now, the fact that you guys are still watching, those of you who are still watching at the end of this video, when I first did my first garden tour, it was 40 minutes long. And I went inside and I told Maya, like, nobody's gonna watch this. I cannot imagine that anybody's gonna watch this. In my first ever garden tour, I actually said, I won't bore you guys with the varieties. And I just said, oh, there's a pepper and there's an eggplant. And everybody's like, no, tell us the varieties. And it was this like, ah, moment for me. Because I was like, I found my people that could go through and enjoy hearing all of this stuff. It just brings me so much joy. It's like my face hurts for smiling so much for thinking about it. I love being able to share this with y'all. Thank you again. I bless you. Until next time.